Okay, we begin the pre-trip evaluation with a visual inspection of the truck. We want to talk about two things in the front, side, and the back of the truck. In the front, I'm going to check to make sure the truck is not leaning to the right, not leaning to the left, and if I intend to move it forward, there's nothing impeding me from doing so. As I come around the truck, I want to make do some initial housekeeping things, like take off the hood latch, because later on I'm going to be opening the hood. I also want to turn on my lighting systems in my four-ways, so I can check my lighting systems as I go around the truck. On the side of the truck, I'm going to make sure there's no puddles of fluids under the truck. I'm also going to make sure there's no obstructions above the truck. Make sure my wheels are chocked. In the back of the truck, I'm going to check the same things in the back of the truck that I checked in front of the truck. I'm going to make sure the truck's not leaning to the right or the left, and there's nothing impeding me from backing up if that's what I intend to do. Once I've done the visual inspection, then I'll go into a more in-depth inspection of the truck to make sure the truck is not going to break down on me, hopefully, as I take it out on the road. So I'll begin by checking the assist bars where my refuse technician is going to be on the back of the truck. I check my assist bars to make sure they're not cracked or broken, and they're secured to the truck, in this case by weld. Check the rear step to make sure the rear step is not cracked, bent, or broken, and secured to the truck, in this case by nuts and bolts. No signs of rust or shiny metal, which would imply that they might be loose. I check my rear deflector or splash guard to make sure, in this particular case, since it's a sanitation cruiser, it's metal, so it's not cracked, bent, or broken, secured to a truck by weld, but most importantly, the specification states that it should be within 12 inches of the ground. So we're gonna make sure it's at 12 inches of the ground. My next step would go check at the air, brake, and tire system of the truck. I'll begin by checking the air chamber, or what is better known as the brake chamber. It's metal, it's not cracked, bent, or broken, secured to the truck by nuts and bolts. Also want to check the air lines on the brake chamber to make sure they're not cracked, dry rotted, or leaking any air, and they're secured by clamp nuts and bolts. Check the rear plug of the brake chamber to make sure it's not cracked, dry rotted, or missing or leaking any air. I'll move on now to the slack adjuster and the push rod. Both items are metal. Make sure they're not cracked, bent, or broken, and that there's missing no hardware. And that if I apply my foot on the service brake, the push rod would not travel more than 1 inch. The next item I'll go to now is my brake drum and my brake shoe. The brake drum is cast iron, so I want to make sure A, it's not cracked, bent, or broken. B, it's pressure sensitive, so I want to make sure to have no illegal weld. And C, I want to make sure there's no residual grease or oil on the brake drum. Next thing I want to check is the brake liner or brake shoe. It's got a steel frame, so it's not cracked, bent, or broken. And the pad, the fiber pad, should be no more than 50% wear. It should be worn dangerously thin. I move now to the inner and outer rim to make sure my inner and outer rim, if I have a two rim scenario here, make sure that both rims are not cracked, bent, or broken. And since it's weight sensitive, no illegal weld. Check my inner and outer tire sidewalls to make sure my sidewalls don't have any abrasions, bruises, or cuts that will be worn down to the tread of the tire that might blow as I put weight on this truck or as I drive this truck down the road. I definitely don't want to see any cord to the tire. Also, I want to come to the top of the tires to make sure the tires are evenly worn and they are pretty much of the same height. Also want to check between the tires to make sure there's no obstruction between the tires and that the tires are not touching each other. That could imply that either I have an overloaded truck or underinflated tires. Non-steering tires. These tires in the back are non-steering. They pretty much follow. So this will make these particular tires can be recapped or regrooved. The tread depth for a non-steering tire needs to be 2/32 of an inch. I check that with the head of a penny or a tread depth gauge to ensure that it's within 2/32 of an inch, at least better. All right, they're going to come out to the outside now to make sure all my lug nuts are present. They are metal, so they're not cracked or broken. No signs of rust or shiny metal what is known in the business of egging of the hold. That will show a little bit of wear on both sides of the lug nut. All the lug nuts are present and that they're tight. I also want to check my axle seal. I most of the time tell my students to check the hub axle seal. That way you don't miss the points there. To make sure it's not cracked or broken, all your nuts are present and none of them are loose and it's not leaking any oil in this particular case. Also check the valve stem to make sure the valve stem, which is metal, it's not cracked or broken, not leaking any air, and that the air pressure is between 90 and 110 pounds. Check that with a air pressure gauge or rubber mallet. Don't want to use wood or metal because you might have spurs or something that might puncture the tire. I move forward now. I check this air brake and tire system the same way I check this air brake and tire system. This is for the purpose of time, but you would check it the same way. Now go to my suspension system. Suspension systems, you could have a couple different types of suspension systems. You could have an airbag or bellows type suspension system. You could have a torque arm, torque bar suspension system. This particular case, we have a leaf spring suspension system. So first thing you want to check, make sure all your leaves are present and that you're not missing more than 1/4 of one leaf. You then want to check to make sure your U-bolts are present. They're not cracked, they're broken. No signs of rust or shiny metal at the nuts and bolts to imply that they may be loose. You want to check your trunnion cap to make sure your trunnion cap is present. It's not cracked or broken. No loose bolts or shiny metal, and it's not leaking any oil or fluid. You also want to check your bushings. There are bushings on both sides of the leaf spring set that connect to each axle or rear. You want to make sure there's no signs of rusty, shiny metal and that the bushings are not cracked, dry rotted, or missing. We'll check now the rear frame of the truck to make sure that it's not cracked or broken and that there's no illegal welds, no loose bolts or shiny metal. Come up to my DOT stripe. DOT stripe is red and white and it must be reflective. Check my marker lamp. A marker lamp is amber in color since it's on the side of the truck. It's not cracked or broken, no condensation buildup. The rubber seal is intact and as you can see it's functional. Move forward now to go underneath and check my drive shaft, my drivetrain from the transmission to the rears. So the drive shaft and the U-joint involved there in the carrier bearing to make sure it's not cracked or broken, no loose bolts or shiny metal, no obstructions, and no signs of rust or shiny metal which imply that they might be loose. Move forward now to my battery box and my batteries. The battery box is not cracked or broken, no loose bolts or shiny metal, which imply looseness. I check the batteries themselves to make sure the batteries are secure and that there's no corrosion or oxidation at the terminals. I'm going to move down now to my air tanks to make sure that my air tanks, which are metal, are not cracked or broken, secured to the truck by nuts and bolts, and that there's no excess water or fluid coming out of my air tanks there. You want to drain your air tanks daily during the normal season. If there's any reason why the air tanks should not be drained, the mechanic shop would direct you to do so on your DVIR, your driver vehicle inspection report. Move forward now to your exhaust pipe muffler to make sure it's not cracked or broken, secured to the truck by nuts and bolts and metal straps. We want to make sure, and most importantly, that there's no signs of carbon monoxide or carbon soot, which is a black powdery type substance. We don't want that. We don't want any cracks or anything like that, or any carbon monoxide or soot to be present. We'll check your exhaust pipe and your exhaust pipe guard to make sure it's not cracked or broken. Secure the truck by nuts and bolts. No signs of rust or shiny metal, which imply looseness. You want to check your step to make sure it's not cracked or broken. Secure your truck by nuts and bolts. When open and close your door, passenger door, to make sure it A, opens and closes, B, that the environmental strip is in place, and that there's no signs of rust or shiny metal at the hinge area. While you're inside, you want to also make sure that you have your road triangles, part of your emergency equipment. You want to make sure you have 3 road triangles present in the box. At this time, you can also check to make sure you have spare circuit breakers and fuses that you would also need if you're going on a journey. Okay, we'll close that. And you have a step light or rear assist lamp, whichever way you want to use it. Want to make sure that it's not cracked or broken, no condensation build up, the rubber seal's intact. Okay. Your front deflector or mud flap there, it's not cracked or broken, secured by nuts and bolts. Again, want to make sure it's within 12 inches of the ground in the specifications. I'll take off this hood lamp, hood strap now. Just open the hood. This is the belt-driven side of the engine. We're going to go through the components here quickly. The air intake and hoses and ducts, air ducts, to make sure they're not cracked or broken. Secured to the truck by nuts and bolts. We check your rubber boots to make sure they're not cracked, dry rotted, leaking any air. Secured by clamp nuts and bolts. We check the exhaust manifold here, or exhaust pipe coming out of the turbocharger to make sure it's not cracked or broken. Secured by clamps, nuts and bolts. No signs of carbon monoxide or carbon soot. We'll come down now to the starter to make sure the starter is not cracked or broken. Secured to the truck by nuts and bolts. No oxidation or corrosion buildup at the terminals. Check the oil filter and the oil cooler. They stand next to each other. They're not cracked or broken. Secured to the truck by nuts and bolts, not leaking any oil. We'll now go to the AC pump, the alternator, and the water pump. These are gear-driven, belt-driven components. So we'll make sure that they're secured to the truck and they are belt-driven. So we've got to check that out. AC pump, not cracked or broken, secured by nuts and bolts. No oxidation or corrosion at the electrical terminals. Alternator, again, secured by nuts and bolts. No signs of rust or shiny metal, which apply looseness. No oxidation or corrosion at its terminal. Water pump. Make sure the water pump's not cracked or broken. Secure the truck by nuts and bolts, not leaking any coolant. And we move down into our serpentine belt. Our serpentine belt. It's not cracked, dry rotted, or frayed. No more than 3/4 of an inch play in the center of the belt. And